In 1980, acclaimed filmmaker Akira Kurosawa was 70 years old. He had made 27 films over almost 4 decades and had just had success with his latest historical epic. At this point in his career, he had already redefined cinema as we know it. Whether it was becoming synonymous with the action movie, influencing an entire generation of filmmakers, or bringing a brand new kind of storytelling to film with his second ever project. Yet, that was years ago. Now, in his 70s, other younger filmmakers were calling him old-fashioned, a needless perfectionist, a stick in the mud. But this did not dissuade him. Kurosawa still wanted to make real an idea that had been in his mind for almost a decade. His final epic, a samurai story based on a Shakespeare play that he felt mirrored his own life. And he would secure enough funding to make it the most expensive film Japan had ever seen. 200 horses, 1,400 extras, 12,000 costumes, each of them hand-sewn by master tailors over 2 years. Filmed partly in the plains outside an active volcano, partly inside 2 of Japan's most famous historical castles, and featuring a set piece where an entire building put up by Kurosawa's team on the slopes of Mount Fuji is burned to the ground, giving the lead actor only one take to run away from it. Ran is truly a movie worth watching. A spectacle beyond spectacle, and a film that makes you feel like you're experiencing the art form for the first time. But how much do you think it cost? For those of you who already know the answer, you probably also know why I'm asking this question. Film budgets are a notoriously tricky thing. We know very little about accounting in cinema, or the specifics of why movies cost as much as they do, or where the money was spent. That's almost never public information. All we do have is a rough estimate of the total cost of each film that comes out. And a worrying trend for almost as long as cinema has existed has been this number getting higher and higher. So, let's try and find out why that is. Let's look at some of the most expensive movies of all time and see if we can't find a pattern. Some sort of hidden science behind the magic of movies.
I see through the bricks to the sea, crumbling castle. Waters rising up, thick and green, crumbling castle.
But before we get into all of that, you might not have noticed, but I just bought a new camera recently, as well as a bunch of new equipment to make these videos easier to film. And the website that's helped me learn how to use all of that is this video's sponsor, Skillshare. As you might know, Skillshare is the largest online learning community, helping creatives with thousands of classes led by experts in film, animation, design, and more. Their goal is to help you take your career, hobbies, and side hustles to the next level. Whether it's getting better at productivity, growing a business, getting started on YouTube, or something more specific like 3D animation, Skillshare offers a wide variety of classes on everything you could want to learn, which is great for someone like me who's constantly looking to branch out and pick up a new skill. Though, like I said, I've actually been getting really into cameras and filmmaking equipment lately, something that's absolutely essential to my career on YouTube. And a class that I found to be incredibly helpful, especially to newcomers, is DSLR Filmmaking from Beginner to Pro by Jordy Vandeput. They go over a wide variety of topics, like all the different settings and basic filmmaking techniques you need to know, and I just think the whole course is incredibly simple and easy to follow. So if picking up a new skill sounds like something you want to do before the end of the year, why not do it with Skillshare? They're actually running a special offer right now, where the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial. Yeah, the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So what better time is there to get started than today? Thanks again to Skillshare, and back to the video. One of the first films to ever majorly break records for its budget was actually 1922's Foolish Wives, which was advertised as the first $1 million movie. And it's been described as, quote, a sensational sex melodrama about an evil man who seduces rich women and takes their money, where you might be shocked to believe the director, Erich von Stroheim, cast himself in the lead. Yeah, we're off to a weird start, and von Stroheim is a weird guy. He was considered one of the first real auteur directors after all, coming into prominence in the 10s and 20s for pushing boundaries across all of his films. And Foolish Wives was, well, I'd say no different, but that would be a lie. It ended up being quite different for a few reasons. You see, von Stroheim had originally intended for the movie to be over 6 hours long, shown across multiple days. For its wealthy European setting, it required several full-scale sets to be built to recreate a Monte Carlo casino, a French hotel, and a Parisian cafe. And not only were these sets constructed on the Universal backlot, but identical sets had to be constructed at a remote location along the San Francisco coast, 300 miles away, for the scenes where the actors might be facing water. Sets that then had to be rebuilt multiple times because the weather along this remote part of the coast kept destroying them. The film shot for 11 months, where von Stroheim would redo takes of this 6-hour epic over and over again, all night, every day, until the reported estimate came to about 326,000 feet of film used. This disastrous production led to the studio begging for the director to slow down and cut costs. However, von Stroheim was highly acclaimed already, and he had cast himself as the main character. To remove him would stop the film from being made. So even though the producers had written into his contract that he had to do what they wanted, he just didn't, and all the producers could do was run ads in the papers bragging about this being the most expensive movie ever made, going so far as to construct a 3-story tall sign in New York that would update the exact cost of the film weekly in giant neon letters. A book chronicling this film's production describes it as, quote, a bad dream from which von Stroheim never recovered, during which he had to deal with terrible weather, angry producers, and one of the main actors dying halfway through the shoot. Though one of my favorite stories is about how the prop department had decided to print out so many replica bills of French currency for a gambling scene that they and the director were arrested by federal agents on charges of counterfeiting. And yet, the only thing to actually stop the film from shooting would happen months later, when the producers just hired people to steal all of the camera equipment and return it back to Universal. The movie then got fucked even further in editing when Hollywood had a major sex scandal pop up, and Stroheim was forced by censors to cut the over 61 miles of film he shot into less than 2.5 hours. Though you could just as easily argue they wanted to cut it because the initial screening started at 9 p.m. and went on until 3:30 in the morning. Either way, the film was chopped up before release and debuted to, drumroll please, $14,000 opening week. Jesus Christ. Also, it's important to note that a competing movie called When Knighthood Was in Flower was filmed around the same time and was produced by William Randolph Hearst, someone known for spending money who gave the production free rein to build gigantic full-scale castle sets for $1.5 million, meaning Foolish Wives was not even the most expensive movie that came out in 1922. Though the 1920s, as you'd expect from a period with a booming economy from just winning a world war, was an amazing time for film budgets, and records kept being beaten for several years, most notably with The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur in 1923 and 25, two massive biblical epics with gigantic sets and set pieces and extensive uses of Technicolor, pushing both of their budgets well above the $1 million range. Though $10 million wouldn't be broken until 1956 and 59, after the Second World War, with the release of The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur. Wait, no, that can't be right. You see, for whatever reason, both films were remade 30 years later into even bigger epics with more money behind them. The Ten Commandments even being directed by the same person across both versions, Cecil B. DeMille, and Ben-Hur coming out shortly after with director William Wyler, who signed on specifically so he could, quote, out-DeMille and make the biggest movie. Considering the originals were both box office hits during the silent film era and based off of obviously successful stories, it seemed like the studios found remaking them in full sound and color was a smart move, casting even bigger stars like Charlton Heston, who was the lead in both movies, then putting the rest of the money into pushing the sets and special effects as far as they would go. The parting of the Red Sea in The Ten Commandments was considered the most difficult special effects shot ever done, involving a full-scale waterfall built on the Paramount backlot, combined with real footage of the Red Sea, with several layers of compositing, matte paintings, and animation to make it work, with it taking about 6 months just for that one sequence. Ben-Hur was no less complicated, and certainly did try to outdo this on nearly every level, shooting with brand new 65mm cameras, each using $100,000 anamorphic lenses that had to be shipped all the way to Rome. It required over 300 sets, one of which was the largest ever built, taking up 18 acres and featuring a 10-foot tall center island and 30-foot tall statues. Over the course of filming, over 2,000 horses were used, and 10,000 extras were brought in. Wyler himself as director was paid about $350,000 along with a percentage of the movie's profit, and Charlton Heston got $250,000 in his initial deal, both of them living in lavish Roman villas with their entire families while shooting, leading to probably over $1 million spent on just the main cast alone. Similarly, the chariot race in Ben-Hur also cost $1 million on its own, as they spent 3 months filming a 9-minute sequence where 9 chariots would race and crash into each other, meaning every main actor in the scene had to be extensively trained how to pilot a chariot, and the cameraman had to sit on top of an imported American car that was the only one fast enough to outrace the horses at full speed. And of course, several famous accidents happened on set where stunt riders were thrown out of their chariots or dragged behind them when they weren't supposed to be, some of which made it into the final film. Again, there's a lot of stories about the production of Ben-Hur, but some quick highlights involve MGM hiring an Italian doctor that was on set at all times giving everyone vitamin shots, which were later suspected to be amphetamines, since everyone that got them went through severe withdrawals after filming. Wyler also apparently once cost the production $15,000 by refusing to shoot in California until they could fly out an extra all the way from Rome to get a single reaction shot they had missed. And he had full reign to do this, because the producer of the film, Sam Zimbalist, died while filming, which required Wyler to take over their role on top of director for an additional $100,000. Now, fortunately, unlike Foolish Wives, all this work would not be for nothing, as Ben-Hur would become the second highest grossing film of all time and win 11 Oscars, a new record.
And the winner is Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur.
Charlton Heston, Ben-Hur.
The Ten Commandments would only win 1 for special effects, though it was nominated for 7. And keep in mind, the highest grossing film was Gone with the Wind, a movie that tied the previous budget record in 1939 and made over $4 billion adjusted for inflation. So all of this success definitely kickstarted the idea that to make a successful movie, you had to spend a lot of money. Come 1960, and the big budget movie would come to a turning point and be pushed to the extreme, with the creation of Cleopatra. This is probably one of the most famous, expensive movies you'll hear about, and it has by far the best accounting of what happened, with an entire tell-all book taken directly from the diary of the lead producer on the film, Walter Wanger. The book goes day by day across the events of the film's production, so I'll be condensing heavily, but I just want to take you through how insane this movie actually was. Production began in June of 1960, with an early budget set by 20th Century Fox at $3 million. Early on, they had trouble casting the lead, and they basically tried every major actress in Hollywood before falling in love with Elizabeth Taylor's performance in the Oscar-nominated Suddenly Last Summer. Elizabeth Taylor then asked for $1 million. In the first of a series of absurd decisions, the producers agree with this, saying that Taylor's the only one who could make this movie work. So they give her the $1 million and grant an additional request that the film be shot outside of Hollywood. This immediately raised the projected budget to $5 million, and the location was set to London. From here, a lot of stuff happens really quickly. The crew goes to London, finds out that there's a strike going on there, so they try going to Italy instead, where they end up paying a producer there $500,000 and ask him to co-produce the film, before realizing that his warehouses are too small and his crew doesn't speak English. So back in London, they find out that the original production warehouses have been taken over by the Air Force, and the English crew is threatening to walk off the set. This is the least of everyone's problems though, because a call for rain has Wanger begging the 20th Century Fox president to move anywhere else to film the outdoor scenes. But he just gets dismissed, and they build the sets anyway. Elizabeth Taylor then gets pneumonia. The movie doesn't even have a finished script yet, since they're still trying to adapt the book it's based on, so they just start shooting exterior shots and any coverage they can. But even that is difficult, since a once-in-a-lifetime rainstorm is hitting London. At this point, over $2 million have been pumped into this film, and the production is bleeding $120,000 a day, renting out cameras and keeping Taylor on set. So, the producers just start looking to scrap the thing, claim the insurance to cover their losses, move on. But insurance doesn't want to cover them, since Taylor has been bringing in outside physicians, which is against the rules. And as soon as Elizabeth does get better and says she's ready to film, the director leaves. Says the project isn't worth it, he's out. So Fox scrambles to get a new one, offering studio regular and director of Suddenly Last Summer, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, a big bag of money. But he's a bit of a perfectionist and has a completely different vision for the film, recasting almost everyone but Taylor, scrapping the old sets and writing a new script from scratch. Over $5 million has now been spent on the film, and since they haven't shot a single full scene yet, it's expected to cost $5 more. Then Elizabeth Taylor gets sick again. this time so severely that she is rushed to the hospital, where they have to perform an emergency tracheotomy on her to save her life. It is apparently so bad that producers are told she's most likely not going to make it. Newspapers have already started printing headlines saying she's dead. But miraculously, she pulls through. And at this point, in March of 1961, the producers officially put the project on hold, giving the lead actress enough time to recover and come back later. Though they still have to scrap all the sets again to clear up studio space. Come September, Liz is looking better, but England is still reigning, so they move back to Italy. Money is now just being blown left and right to try and get this thing rolling, including spending 25 grand just to have a personal physician come follow Liz around and keep her from getting sick again. Insurance is refusing to cover the movie, so any trips to the hospital have to be paid for out of pocket. By now, she's costing them thousands of dollars per day to keep on set, so the studio just begins filming without a finished script again and rebuilds all the props and sets necessary. Meaning only a full year after production initially started did they begin shooting the movie. It then starts to rain in Italy. A full breakdown of the budget at this point, which we're lucky enough to have because Wanger just wrote it down, has it at $15 million. The cast and crew are at 3.5, the extras $1 million flat, the wardrobe another, and the sets costing $3 total. 20th Century Fox, mind you, has still convinced themselves that they can finish the movie for less than 12. They've spent more than that already. So an accountant comes in and finally snaps people out of their delusions, saying the total estimate is going to be closer to $24 million, already 9 more than Ben-Hur. Filming starts going smoothly though. Liz and the main cast are showing up to set, but oh, what's this? There's a small rumor spreading around that Liz Taylor and her co-star Richard Burton have fallen in love. Well, both of them are currently married and Liz just adopted a child. Surely it just looks that way because they're playing lovers in the movie and they're just really good actors. Surely that's the case. Anyways, Liz gets sick several more times. An infection in her leg, a couple colds, at one point she breaks her hand during an intense scene, all of which cost days and weeks and tens of thousands of dollars. She's also notably upset from all the rumors. And from the paparazzi. I haven't mentioned them, but they've been rabid this whole shoot. And now it's gotten to like Mission Impossible level antics they're trying to pull just to get some photos of a potential affair. Paying off personal assistants, dressing up as priests to try and sneak onto set. A female publicist was reported to be sneaking hidden cameras into her hairdo, and like 1960s cameras, which are huge. In March of 1962, the expected budget has been bumped up to $27 million, and Fox is starting to bleed out. All of their TV productions have run dry for various reasons, and the company is about $75 million in the hole. So the president has just gone all in on Cleopatra needing to be the highest grossing movie of all time. But hey, at least they're finally getting some progress done. They're getting a couple pages done a day, just film some big crowd scenes. Seems like things are looking up. Never mind, Liz Taylor just got in a car crash. She has a black eye now. By May, the budget is $30 million. The board members of 20th Century Fox are rioting. Liz has just put out a story saying she's filing for divorce. Her extended time on set is costing the production over 10 grand a day, and they haven't even filmed some of the biggest scenes in the movie. The producers, Wanger included, are just doing anything they can to get this thing done. They're cutting out big scenes, stopping new sets from getting built, reusing costumes so they don't have to make any more, whatever it takes. By June, word gets out that they're still not done yet, so Fox shareholders just stage a takeover. The president of the company is forced to resign. Wanger and the producers are taken off salary, Liz has to be off the set by the end of the week, and filming has to wrap by the end of the month. And as if to tie a bow on this entire thing, the final scenes of the movie shot with the first unit involve flying to Egypt for a big battle. But when they get there, they have no extras, they're missing equipment, and they have to sleep in the desert. Someone on set has the bright idea to just bus a bunch of college students from Alexandria to play soldiers, not realizing there's a massive conflict between the Alexandrians and the locals. So in trying to film the final battle of the movie, they end up starting a real-life riot. But they get the film done. July 24th of 1962 is the last day of shooting, almost 2 years after production started. They still need a couple months for editing and pickups. Also, the new president of Fox fires Mankiewicz only to immediately rehire him and get him to do reshoots. And the final film is estimated to cost $37 million. The most expensive film ever made by more than twice that of Ben-Hur. Adjusted for inflation, it's still the 35th most expensive movie at over $300 million. And do you want to know the craziest part? Cleopatra did bank off of its publicity. It went on to be the highest grossing film of the year after only 3 weeks into its run, staying at the top for a total of 12 weeks and staying in theaters for 63, which is on top of the money made overseas and the TV broadcast rights getting sold for a record-breaking $5 million. This is a movie that's famous for costing too much and is often considered the greatest flop of all time, but it almost definitely broke even, which I think is almost more interesting than if it had failed. Because even a production this troubled and this famous for having problems in nearly every aspect could not stop Cleopatra from being ultimately kinda successful. It got nominated for 9 Oscars, it won 4. It is now one of the most well-known movies of all time. And though I don't think anyone involved would ever try something like that again, especially not Walter Wanger, who quit making movies, and the president of Fox, who resigned, but I do think that everyone who wasn't a part of this film only learned the wrong lesson from it. I mean, if Ben-Hur could win 11 Oscars, and even Cleopatra could break even, then all that proves is that some movies might actually just be too big to fail. If the production is famous enough, or if the stars are big enough, then you can seemingly always get your money back, no matter how much you put into it. So that insane contract that Elizabeth Taylor got for $1 million, that's what movie stars in the 70s like Charles Bronson got for every film. Going forward a decade and a half, the next movie that would break the record for most expensive ever was Superman in 1978 at $55 million, which cost as much as it did because it was technically being filmed at the same time as its sequel, something that would become a common practice. And to play Superman's father, Jor-El, Marlon Brando asked for $3.7 million and a percentage of gross to end up shooting for just 12 days, earning a total of $19 million for basically his star power alone, as Christopher Reeves only made $250,000 for the leading role in the film. Superman did not actually beat out Cleopatra's record though, not adjusted for inflation, and the next several big-budget action movies that would claim to break the record wouldn't come close either. Not Total Recall, not Die Hard 2, not Terminator 2, not even Waterworld in 1995. All movies which had extended productions, A-list actors with gigantic contracts, and a metric ton of special effects. Waterworld in particular is a movie I could spend another entire segment covering all the issues with. It was initially greenlit for $100 million, which was still a record-breaking budget at the time, but due to being shot out on the ocean outside Hawaii, the movie took much longer to film than expected, going from an initially planned 96 days to over 150, mostly because they were at the complete mercy of the weather, and everything on set kept breaking or sinking or drifting away, and because, like all the other big expensive movies, it started filming without a finished script. So a lot of the crew, including the assistant director, just left the production partway through. And even still, to put it in perspective, its $175 million final budget is still under the $185 million that Cleopatra would have cost in 1995. And just like Cleopatra, even though the film was a complete disaster and is now known as a major flop, it reportedly made over $260 million at the box office, which, even including marketing costs, had it most likely making its money back. Yeah, that's right, even Waterworld broke even. Though the first movie to actually break Cleopatra's adjusted budget record and do substantially better at the box office than Waterworld was James Cameron's Titanic, all the way in 1997, with a budget of $200 million. To summarize why Titanic was so expensive, I think we only really need 5 words. They built the fucking Titanic. And not just one, not even 2, but multiple 1/8 and 1/20th scale models alongside a full-sized version of the ship that only had about 10 to 25% shaved off for parts not visible to camera, which combined with the 40-acre large waterfront set and the 17 million gallon water tank they were put in cost $40 million alone. Mind you, the initial budget for this movie was only set at $100 million, but I don't think James Cameron, being a director who is devoted to doing elaborate special effects and gigantic productions, ever had any intention of sticking to this. He already technically broke the record back with T2 and True Lies, so with Titanic, he would not only out DeMille DeMille, he would remove DeMille from the conversation entirely. However, something interesting to keep in mind, and something we might not think about over 2 decades later, is that the film didn't actually have that much star power behind it. This was the film that made the careers of Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, after all. DiCaprio was a little more well-known and was offered $2.5 million, Winslet only making 1 or 2, reports vary, but both of these were not even close to the upper end of what movie stars in this era could make. Combined, it wasn't even half of Liz Taylor's adjusted contract. But that's because it's actually Cameron himself who was the star here, making more than both leads in just initial fees alone, and being a major reason people had faith in this movie. Though he would give up some of his payment during negotiations to convince the executives to increase the budget, he would keep a percentage of profit that net him over $115 million. Cameron was a tyrant on set, too. Pretty much every account of people working with him involves the words yelling, screaming, or some form of expletive. The most forgiving description of the man I could find was that of an uncompromising, hard-charging perfectionist. Perfectionist being a word we've seen thrown around multiple times now, and almost never in a good context.
Derek, I want to see you moving. Don't get down at the bottom of the boat. Come right down the center. Come crawl across the oars. Fall on somebody. Get up.
And as if proving their point, Cameron's only rebuttal to this was, "I'm not a perfectionist, I'm a rightist. I do something until it's right and then move on to the next thing." So after a long 160 days of shooting things until they're right, over 30 more than initially planned, the budget was just out of control. For one sequence in the film, they had to raise the entire deck of the ship in the air and film 100 stuntmen sliding down it into the water, which injured several of them and cost several $100,000 every time they had to set the shot up. Getting so out of hand that 20th Century Fox president Bill Mechanic actually flew down to the set to try and talk Cameron into cutting down the movie. To which he responded, "If you want to cut my film, you'll have to fire me. And to fire me, you'll have to kill me." So, the president flies back up to LA and starts negotiating with Paramount to give them more money. And Paramount gets a sweet deal out of this, securing the US distribution rights for only $65 million, leaving Fox with the international rights, which still earned them $1.5 billion. Because yes, we all know that Titanic went on to become the highest grossing movie of all time, just behind Gone with the Wind. This movie won 11 Oscars, matching the record set by Ben-Hur. It stayed in the theaters for years, with the average moviegoer seeing it multiple times. Even a book about the making of the film became a New York Times bestseller.
And the Oscar goes to Titanic.
Deborah L. Scott for Titanic.
James Horner, Titanic.
James Cameron for Titanic.
I'm the king of the world.
The story surrounding Titanic was obviously one of success, that James Cameron spent the most money to make the most money, and ended up on top. He even made it a period piece romance, which was considered taboo after Cleopatra. But he made it work, and he successfully bulldozed a new budget milestone, even if he himself didn't think so. In his own words, if there are lessons to be learned from Titanic, it is not that films will now cost more, it's that the media doesn't get to hang a movie with a rush to judgment before it comes out. And that last sentence is actually pretty telling, because I should point out almost all of these most expensive movies I've covered so far, including Titanic, had horrible press leading up to their release. It turns out burning gigantic wads of cash is a pretty bad thing in the eyes of the general public, especially when you set a record for burning the most cash. This is obviously apparent on disasters like Waterworld or Cleopatra, but even the smoother sailing Titanic did not escape it. Quote, by late fall of 1996, the press was trashing Titanic. Persistent reports of a changing release date, abusive working conditions endured by the cast and crew, and the fact that the film was wildly over budget contributed to a negative media attitude towards the film. This would, of course, turn around after the movie was screened and everyone loved it, but this negative attention was something that studios wanted to avoid in the first place. Keep in mind, Titanic was only so open about its costs because James Cameron didn't give a fuck, which ultimately might have hurt it even more. So the story of Jack and Rose had driven home the message that big movies did better, but it had also frightened executives about people finding out how much they were spending to make that happen. When we skip ahead to one of the next movies that would break the budget record, this time Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3, it is very notably the highest budget ever acknowledged by a major studio, not just the highest budget. Now, people knew it was going to be expensive. It's the third installment of a very successful trilogy and part of the new comic book boom that was just getting started. And the first and second movie both got 130 and 200 million. So this one was officially reported to cost 260. However, several producers and Hollywood insiders were adamant that the film was way over that. The number thrown around was $350 million spent, due to an increasingly long shoot with several big actors and a production marked by the ever-so-famous changing script. I mean, the film took 3 years to make, that's as long as Cleopatra, and Sam Raimi has gone on record saying the producers pressured him into adding things that bloated the film, like Venom. However, the studio refused to admit they went over. They held firm to $260 million, and everyone on board kept their lips sealed while the producers went out of their way to do interviews to try and dismiss any concerns. So this is where breaking down expensive films becomes complicated. Executives and producers are saying one thing, directors and actors and Hollywood insiders might say another, and we know the budgets are getting bigger. Even just due to inflation, they'd have to. But nobody wants to be the one to break the record, because that's bad press. I mean, Spider-Man 3 only broke the record after publicly denying an even higher number. Who knows what other movies might have crossed it without us knowing? Take something like James Cameron's Avatar, a movie you'd easily suspect to have been the most expensive at some point. Yet, it only has an official budget of $237 million. It never publicly broke any record. But the reports of the behind the scenes of this film have it costing as much as $500 million. And we'll never know, because I guarantee that Cameron and Raimi and many other filmmakers are now specifically put under NDA to make sure we don't.
3, 2, 1, go!
Actually, hold on to that thought, because the next 3 films that would officially acknowledge they were the most expensive, as you might guess, are all owned by Disney. Specifically, the second and third Pirates of the Caribbean films as a combined production that cost $450 million total, as well as the fourth movie sequel spin-off thing that cost $400 million on its own. These movies have all the usual suspects of expense. I mean, Johnny Depp, Keira Knightley, and Orlando Bloom were not cheap at this point, and the film shot for a whopping 272 days. For the Maelstrom sequence in the third movie, they built full-scale ships on hydraulic lifts, then tilted them 15 degrees and blew 25,000 gallons of water per minute at them with 100-mile-per-hour industrial fans, all lit with a special rig that apparently used 108,000 kilowatts of power. The sequence took 4 months to finish and had over 400 VFX shots, with Jeffrey Rush summarizing the process by saying,
"This is how Cecil B. DeMille probably did direct."
Though something questionable you'll notice is that most of the production information we have on the Pirates films comes from their own press kit given out by Buena Vista. Just a quick look on the Wikipedia page for these movies and you can see these cited repeatedly, as well as a bunch of other articles that are clearly just repeating the information from them. Information that is so clearly just marketing copy. The actors had nothing but praise for their fearless leader, director Gore Verbinski. "I honestly don't know how Gore is able to be upright after all that he's done," says Johnny Depp of his director. "Gore is one of the greatest directors I've ever worked with," prefers Bill Nye. Adds Orlando Bloom, "It's funny because Jerry Bruckheimer is huge, a gigantic force in the industry, but he's also a mate, a really good guy with a wealth of work behind him, but just a man loving his work and loving life." There's like 80 pages of this. And like, I'm sure Verbinski and Bruckheimer are great guys. I'm sure these things were actually said about them, but they are explicitly cherry-picked quotes by Disney. After all, that's what a press kit is for. But it's almost all the information places like Wikipedia can find about the production of these films. Information that conveniently doesn't mention cost or budget anywhere. So if there's one thing that Disney got way better at than any other studio, besides spending more money, it's keeping everything behind the scenes a complete secret. For Pirates of the Caribbean 3, they've effectively written their own Wikipedia article, talking about what a great time this production was, and how they never ever spent a penny they didn't mean to or had any issues on set. Don't you even dare to suggest otherwise. To give an idea of where we're at now, for the fourth Pirates film, the weird spin-off sequel thing with a digitally de-aged Johnny Depp, the only reason we know that it crossed $400 million spent is because the UK introduced tax credits for up to 25% of the cost of film shot there. So, a lot of big movies started shooting there. However, financial statements in the UK are publicly filed, unlike the US, meaning that films that benefit from that tax credit get their full production budget published online. Yet, even still, when you see the total budget of a film on Wikipedia or Google or something, those numbers are after that tax credit is applied, because we don't count the quarter of the film paid for by the UK government. And keeping on the topic of shady practices, we actually get to what is technically the current record holder for the most expensive film ever made: Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Again, you can figure out all the reasoning as to why it was expensive. It's Star Wars, and not just Star Wars, but a legacy sequel that Disney absolutely needed to get right, after spending billions of dollars acquiring the property. But as you can expect, every piece of behind the scenes for The Force Awakens has been meticulously curated by Disney. Quoting Mark Hamill himself, "I had this massive, oppressive, sword of Damocles NDA hanging over my head." And that's just in reference to not being allowed to spoil the movie. All we can figure out from UK filings and various reports is that the film's initial stated budget was much lower than it actually was. As Deadline reported in 2015, the film cost a reasonable $259 million to make. Yet after the movie hit theaters and UK filings went public, we found out it actually cost $533 million, or $447 after tax credits, which is the final number on Wikipedia. Though even more recent reports have the total at $639 million. Because in order to get the full credit, Disney had to open a shell company in the UK and funnel their money through them, and it conveniently took them like 8 years to do all the paperwork. But this is insane, because without these UK filings, we might never have known that the movie cost over twice as much as Disney publicly said it did. Every outlet at the time comfortably repeats the budget was $260 million, which wouldn't be out of the ordinary for a film at that time, even though the actual budget was anything but ordinary. On a completely unrelated note, no MCU film has ever officially been the most expensive movie ever. The closest that they ever got was Infinity War and Endgame, which was a combined production again, shooting one after the other, and the combined cost of this is something that Marvel really doesn't want us to know. The official budgets given are $350 to $400 million each, conveniently just below the record for most expensive that you'd find on something like Google. But Joe Russo, one of the directors, while giving talks at a film festival, seemingly let it slip that they actually cost over $500 million each, for a total of $1 billion.
The trick with that is it's very risky, because we're talking about in the case of, I don't know if these numbers have ever been accurately reported, but like in the case of Avengers Endgame or Infinity War, each of those movies was $500 million plus, right? So this is an incredible amount of money that is being spent on these films.
So of course, Marvel immediately starts denying this, with executive producer Kevin Feige going out of his way to say it's absurd on the press tours where they're even allowed to ask him about it. Whether it's true or not, you can definitely tell that Marvel does not want anybody to think that it is, because it would be terrible press for this continuing franchise. But you can easily imagine that these movies broke the record. They had like 50 big-name actors running around in CGI suits doing action scenes for over 2 years of filming, each. In their paranoid attempt to stop spoilers, they would shoot fake scenes and reshoot things multiple times and bring actors to set they didn't need to keep people in the dark. Both films had over 3,000 cutting-edge VFX shots, which were shipped off to half a dozen studios. All things I'm sure the director would be intimately aware of, since all of the other directors we've talked about had precise knowledge of the budgets of their films. But, maybe Joe Russo just didn't. Maybe he just has no idea how much his own movies cost. That's probably it. Just as one final point of comparison, Robert Downey Jr. made $2.5 million for the first Iron Man movie in 2008, with the director Jon Favreau even comparing his importance to the film to Johnny Depp's in Pirates of the Caribbean. For the first Avengers film, though, he made $50 million, and for the upcoming Avengers film, he's set to make over $100 million in fees alone. For reference, Elizabeth Taylor's insanely expensive Cleopatra contract is only worth $10 million today. So now, we've finally reached the top of the mountain for film expenses. At least that we know of. Again, pretty much the only info we're able to get for budgets nowadays comes from leaks and loose tongues, which these studios have gotten much better at suppressing. And none of this might seem that important. After all, who cares about prying into the finances of these big film studios? As long as they're not breaking the law and they're creating jobs and paying people, they should be allowed to do whatever they want with their money. I mean, they're not Breaking the law, right? Well, in January of 1990, the Paramount film Coming to America had been out for about 2 years, and during this time, it came to the attention of one Art Buchwald that the movie was nearly identical to a script he had written and submitted to them years earlier, one they officially rejected. Buchwald sued Paramount for a percentage of profits. However, Paramount refused to pay him out because they said the movie was actually a net loss, despite publicly making about 10 times more at the box office than it cost to make. The court case, Buchwald v. Paramount, was brought to a judge who found that Paramount's process to determine profit was completely made up and unfair, so Buchwald had grounds to sue them, which made Paramount immediately settle for $1 million, because to go to trial would mean exposing their actual accounting practices and would let anyone else sue them for unfair profit calculations. This situation of movie studios doing shady accounting to mark profitable movies as losses and avoid paying people is actually so common that it has been dubbed Hollywood accounting. It even has an entire Wikipedia entry. I highly suggest reading it, because you can clearly see a pattern of films having completely opaque bookkeeping processes specifically designed to put money in the pockets of executives and keep it out of everyone else's. Unfortunately for these studios, though, their tricks have been exposed since then. The most notable example being Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, whose income statement leaked online in 2010, which revealed that despite making hundreds of millions in profit at the box office, Warner Bros. Charged themselves a $200 million distribution fee for the movie, alongside $57 million in interest for a loan they took out from their own company, all of which conveniently put the film into a loss and meant nobody involved would get paid a percentage. The Lord of the Rings films, since I haven't talked about them yet, are actually an incredibly interesting example of this, because the whole film trilogy was made as one big production for $260 to $360 million, which isn't even all that terrible compared to what Disney's doing today. But because the films were shot in New Zealand, the subsidies they got from them, alongside subsidies from the UK and Germany, and international ticket pre-sales, supposedly covered the entire production cost outright. New Line Cinema didn't have to put up a single cent. Yet, even after becoming some of the most successful movies of all time, with Return of the King tying the record of 11 Oscars, and the whole franchise making billions, the studio reported a net loss, which meant that J.R.R. Tolkien's estate actually made nothing from the films since they were offered a percentage. And so the estate, along with Peter Jackson himself, who got similarly screwed, took New Line Cinema to court. That's not even the biggest case though, because recently the production company TSG Entertainment sued Disney for hundreds of millions of dollars, stating that they offered to co-finance over 140 movies with $3.3 billion in investing. Yet after looking at the finances for some of them, they found that Disney was using Hollywood accounting to pay them back millions of dollars less per film than what they were owed. Disney going so far as to take extra money from them in non-existent distribution fees, leading to the lawsuit only being settled this year for an undisclosed amount. So even when these expensive movies are partially or entirely funded by other companies or government subsidies or tax credits, they are still fucking over everyone involved to keep every cent and not have to pay anyone what they deserve. It's just a common practice at this point, and something that definitely applies to a lot of the most expensive movies we've talked about. These companies don't just keep their accounting a secret for PR reasons or privacy concerns, they do it because they're cooking the books. They always have been. As just a brief aside and a specific example of how films have gotten more exploitative, we can look at the over-reliance on VFX as part of films' budgets, something that has been increasingly apparent since the 90s. Special effects have always been a big part of expenses, but notably, special effects artists have largely been unionized workers who are paid on-set wages like everyone else. After all, they've been right there building sets and rigs and pyrotechnics in movies for almost a century. Yet VFX artists, as a newer industry, have largely been non-union contractors that can be hired to work on a project long after it's finished shooting, meaning that productions can film everything on big green screen sets for cheap, then ship all of the shots off to the lowest bidding studios they can get, paying tens of thousands of artists far less than they would a full crew of unionized workers, leading to VFX taking up more and more of every big production's pipeline. We haven't even talked about animation at all, it's not really relevant, but I just want to point out that the most expensive animated film of all time was Tangled at $260 million, a 2010 film that was in development for a decade that completely reinvented Disney's animation pipeline, building all the 3D infrastructure they would use to make their future films like Frozen, and spending 6 years just developing several completely new technologies to do so, like all of the insane hair physics required in the movie. The second most expensive animated movie of all time, conveniently at $250 million, was The Lion King remake in 2019, a shot-for-shot remake of The Lion King in photorealistic CG, which on top of being a very obvious cash cow, was shot on virtual sets and shipped off to a third-party VFX studio. How much did any of them get paid? Was the movie made with VFX because animators are too expensive? Is the budget even accurate? We'll never know. Thankfully, some recent studios, like one of the companies working on the Avatar movies, have successfully unionized, but for a large part of the industry, VFX is the bottom of the totem pole, something that big movies have invested more and more into because they know that it gets them the most work done for cheap. And if studios are willing to screw over J.R.R. Tolkien and Peter Jackson out of their earnings, I can't imagine what they're doing to the tens of thousands of workers they're hiring who don't have big, expensive legal teams. So let's get back around to the question asked at the start of the video. How much did Ran cost to make? This gigantic 160-minute historical epic, the most expensive movie ever made in Japan at time of release. Well, it cost $12 million. In 1985, mind you, meaning it's closer to $30 million today. I'd compare this to some of the other movies we've covered so far, but the only one cheaper adjusted for inflation is Foolish Wives at $18 million. Ben-Hur, the first one, cost $72 million. Ben-Hur, the second one, cost $162 million. And everything gets more expensive from there. For comparison, a movie from this year, Challengers, which is about a love triangle between tennis players, cost $55 million. Even adjusting for relative economics of different countries, Ran cost 820 times the yearly average salary of Japan in 1985. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the most expensive movie of 1988, cost 1,836 times the yearly average salary in the US. And just for fun, The Force Awakens cost 15,189 times the average salary of the US in 2015. But you could probably already guess this was the case. Most foreign films are made considerably cheaper than anything Hollywood can produce. The largest Bollywood movie, which used to be RRR until a sci-fi film from this year dethroned it, only cost $75 million. And RRR shot for 270 days and had action scenes with thousands of extras that took months to shoot, one of them costing $5 million alone. The most expensive French movie is only $113 million. The most expensive Korean film, Okja, at $50, was co-produced with the US. And China's most expensive project, The Battle at Lake Changjin, cost $200 million only because it was commissioned by the Central Propaganda Department and used 70,000 real soldiers from the People's Liberation Army. Yet, the reason I wanted to talk about Ran is because after having seen the movie and its subsequent making of documentary, I feel like it gives a different perspective on the art of large-scale filmmaking. And I hope after going through its production, you'll understand why. The movie had been in production for almost a decade, as this complex idea Kurosawa was always trying to achieve. This adaptation of King Lear that would depict a powerful man whose empire crumbles around him in spectacular fashion. Yet, it was a movie he could never make, even after winning nearly every award a director could get, including an honorary Oscar for Rashomon before foreign films were even officially eligible to win those. Japanese studios just never wanted to fund him. "We are negotiating, but we cannot invest in the production because it has a huge scale for us," said Toho president Isao Matsuoka, explaining that Toho could not afford anything above $6 million for an in-house production. The following year, Toho had spent more than $10 million on its in-house remake/sequel of Godzilla. The only breakthrough Kurosawa had after his go-to studio Toho refused him was due to the success of his previous epic, Kagemusha, a film that did well and got critical international appraisal, which drew the attention of French producer Sergei Silberman, who offered to fund part of this new project. So with that, alongside a loan from a Japanese bank and distribution handled by 3 different companies, they were able to start shooting. The shoot for Ran then took 11 months, filming in real historical locations and on the slopes of Mount Fuji, as it was one of the only places with a large enough rural setting to accommodate the movie's vision. And I've talked about the castle and costumes, but to get into the specifics, the tens of thousands of costumes in the film, at Kurosawa's behest, were made with authentic 16th century dyes and fabrics that cost over $1 million alone. And the castle set in the movie actually cost $1.6 million, being constructed out of real wood materials, all just to be burned down in a scene that they had one chance to film. As Kurosawa says, without speaking a word and with a few gestures to rely on, Nakadai must convey the disintegration of a great mind and powerful will. With his castle consumed in flames around him, his soldiers all dead or dying, he must emerge alone through the billowing clouds of smoke, staring straight ahead and walk down a long flight of steps, each a foot or so high. I didn't want him to stumble or look down at his feet, but each time I tried to go down these steps myself during rehearsals, I had to be helped by 2 or 3 people. Since the castle was literally burning, we had only one take to shoot the scene. If he had stumbled, it would have weakened the intensity of the scene, but we would have to accept it. But Nakadai did it perfectly, without a single misstep, staring sightlessly like a sleepwalker or a madman. Though, unfortunately, the filming of this set piece would be one of the few parts of the production with a happy ending. During the shooting of the film, not only did the choreographer, Ryo Kuze, die of a heart attack, but so did Kurosawa's longtime collaborator and sound recorder, Fumio Yanaguchi. And worst of all, Kurosawa's own wife Yoko was diagnosed with a terminal illness. As Kurosawa's daughter recalls, I can remember telling him, "It's incurable, there's no hope, she has 4 months to live." There was a long pause, after which he said only, "Ah, Soka. Well, that's it." This news was delivered to Kurosawa in October. In January of the following year, shooting for Ran was suspended so Kurosawa could be with his wife. He arrived at her hospital bed, still wearing clothes from work, and 5 days later, she passed away. Another week after that, Kurosawa would return to set.
そういう時にうちの母があなたには何百人も待ってる人がいる。あなたが働かなきゃみんなは働けないし困るんだよっていろんな段取りもしてあるんだし、いろんな迷惑をかけるんだからもういつでも速やかに映画の現場に戻りなさいっていうことを言っていた母だったし、やっぱりそこで、よく分かったんじゃない？うちの父も。それでもうすぐに帰って働いてました。
As Stuart Galbraith writes, it can be argued that with its betrayals from within and Hidetora's fall from grace, Ran is autobiographical. One sees the connection most clearly, wrote Donald Ritchie, in the parallel between the later years of Kurosawa and those of the warlord Hidetora Ichimonji. Both men have been, in a sense, dispossessed. Hidetora can find no home, no castle to take him in. Kurosawa could find no studio, no funding for his films. He was spurned by his former studio Toho and ignored by the others. So he was, like Lear himself, forced to wander. On his part, Kurosawa admitted, "I resemble Lear in that the studio I always worked for, Toho, has betrayed me. But I had no such intention in doing this film." Ran wrapped production in February of 1985. It had been 1 month behind schedule, so it was unable to premiere at the Cannes Film Festival. Instead, the movie aired at the Tokyo International Film Festival, which Kurosawa did not attend. The movie did well in theaters, but only made its money back at the tail end of its 7-week theatrical run. And because of the French co-production, Kurosawa's hostility towards Toho, and the movie's bad press coming from its incredibly large budget, Ran wasn't even submitted to the Academy Awards for Best Foreign Film. Though it did win an Oscar for costume design, and Kurosawa presented the award for Best Picture, after being nominated for Best Director. Call me a film snob or whatever, but I'd consider Ran to be a significantly more impressive, spectacular, and quite frankly better film than most of the most expensive movies we've covered so far. Even with a rather tiny budget by Hollywood standards, it manages to become one of the most beautiful and grandiose movies you'll ever see. And it's only elevated by knowing of the hardships behind its production. And ironically, whether intentional or not, I think the movie captures the sort of nihilistic view of the industry that Kurosawa had. A massive empire, collapsing due to its own viciousness, burning down everything around it. Though, it's here I'd like to point out that I've actually been lying to you. Ran was not ever the most expensive film Japan had ever seen, despite a lot of media reporting that it was. The most expensive movie, at the time at least, was Virus, directed by Kinji Fukasaku in 1980, a movie featuring American actor George Kennedy for $13 million. When we look at big budget movies today and try to track their history back to the beginning, we can see that not a lot has actually changed. The most expensive movies are often remakes, like Ben-Hur and The Ten Commandments. They focus on special effects, whether that's building a real-life Titanic or a fully CG main character. And they have a fascination with expensive actors that bring audiences to theaters, be it Elizabeth Taylor, Marlon Brando, or Robert Downey Jr. You can argue that the effects have gotten worse, or the actors aren't as compelling, or the remakes are less interesting, but the reasoning behind them has always remained the same. Expensive films can often seem driven by perfectionist directors with a point to prove. Some of them wanting to out-DeMille DeMille, some of them wanting to do things until they're right, some of them simply wanting to make a film that can define their legacy. And this can compound with a lack of planning, bad luck, or any number of other factors to balloon a budget out of control. But the real key to the most expensive movies ever made, especially recently, is the producers, because they ultimately control where all the money goes, and they've been gaining far more power over filmmakers than ever before due to the rise of corporations like Disney. Directors, if left unchecked, can absolutely create a big, expensive mess of a movie, but producers, if left unchecked, will regularly deny filmmakers the ability to make art at all. They've done this for Kurosawa, they've done this for David Lynch, they most recently did this to Francis Ford Coppola, and they will do this while blowing hundreds of millions of dollars on big, bloated blockbusters, even when they have problems on set and terrible planning and no direction whatsoever. When it comes to expensive movies, we've seen Hollywood executives try to solve all their problems by throwing more money at them, seemingly the only thing they've learned since the 60s being how to keep that a secret. It took us roughly 40 years of cinema before we made the first $1 million movie. It took us 34 years to go from 1 million to 10, 22 years to go from 10 million to 50, 16 years to go from 50 to 100, and even after films started lying about how much they cost to make, 20 years to go from 100 to 500 million. We will, someday in our lifetimes, encounter the first $1 billion movie. And honestly, I think it'll be pretty good. It'll certainly have some famous actors and tons of special effects, an acclaimed director at the helm. But before that movie even comes out, I want us to have a better understanding of why it costs that much. I want us to understand how films lie about their finances to screw people over, how they exploit workers to pinch pennies, how they deny financing for acclaimed directors to blow it on cash cows, and how their only goal is to keep us from realizing this is happening. James Cameron once said, "Filmmaking is war. There's no other way to look at it. It's a great battle, a battle between business and aesthetic." But I think that the way that Hollywood has seen it for decades now has been that business is aesthetic. More money means a better picture. Some movies are just too big to fail, and they've rarely been proven wrong about that. So when that new film comes out that's revealed to be the most expensive movie ever made, I don't want you to just think about how much it cost, I want you to think about what that cost actually means. Thanks for watching.